I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Deloff.
Dean.
Matt. Matt, we both have something to say, obviously, because I know what we're talking about, and I know you have a lot of thoughts about it, but I did just want to kind of introduce an idea at the top, which is I think that we should change the name of this podcast to the 800 Club.
Oh, okay. That's great.
It's one more 100 than the one that everyone's heard of, and I think that it really establishes our superiority to that other show, and I think there's a lot of potential to grow the brand and to dip into the savings of all kinds of evangelical people listening at home.
That's a great idea, but what if I know the 800 Club makes a lot of sense for naming purposes. You got the 700 Club, and then we'd be the 800 Club, but what if we skipped 800 altogether and became the 900 Club in honor of the man himself, Anthony Hawk, the guy who did the big 900 on a skateboard?
Right, St. Anthony Hawk for sure. Or we could go the other direction, and we could be the 420 Club. I feel like that might be a closer vibe.
Sure. Also fine. No problem. No problem with that one either.
Man, what a shame. What a shame that we didn't think of that name when we started the Patreon.
Oh, dang, we really goofed. We goofed up so bad because that could have been the name of it. Oh my gosh. I would love to invent a time machine, go back and kick myself right in the keister.
Okay, listen, if you're listening to this podcast and you're like, I've always wanted to start a Christian podcast about evangelicals, but I've never known what to call it, you can just have that name for free, and I will listen to at least the first episode of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Please steal that idea. That's a good one. It's a good one to steal. It's like if you have more than one coat, you're stealing that coat from somebody else. And we have two great ideas for a podcast. And if we have two, we're stealing it from you. So please take it. Take this great podcast / coat from us. Folks, we're talking about Pat Robertson today. There's no other way around it. He died, and we have to tell you about it. And that's we're legally obligated as formerly evangelical people to do our penance and talk about the death of Pat Robertson, a guy who I didn't like very much when he died, and after kind of researching this episode a bit, I like even less. So here we are today.
Yeah, he's not a good one, but his whole brand is trying to convince you that he is a good one. He died on June 8th. He hosted the 700 Club. He also ran for president in 1988, which I think is extremely funny. He founded an evangelical university called Regent University, and he spent his life trying to organize evangelicals into a political force, and he was actually pretty successful at doing that. And we're going to zero in on a little bit about it. But, man, Matt, have you ever watched an episode of the 700 Club?
So never on purpose, that's for sure. But like every now and again, I would see one accidentally. Here's a wild story. One time I had just graduated from high school and I was going to a community college. And my mom, for whatever reason, like she knew this person at our church who worked at like a local Christian broadcasting network station.
Like a cable access Christian station?
Yeah, exactly. It was like a local one, and they would they'd play the 700 Club on that channel and all kinds of other stuff. they would also record 700 Club type shows, but they're in Spanish, and they have like a studio in this like small town in Illinois just for that. Anyway, so she like connected me with this person who did that at our church, and like I had to go there once just to see how it all like worked, because I guess that she thought that this would be like a great experience for me, and it wasn't great. It was fine. Thanks, Mom. I appreciate it. For sure. Thank you for making me the person I am. But also, this was not exactly up my alley. All that to say, I'm familiar with the 700 Club. I know a bit about it.
Clearly, I mean, you've peeked behind the veil. It seems that's some real like Tim and Eric content fodder. I feel like.
Totally.
That's cool. I also never really watched it on purpose, but I did occasionally catch it on TV. I think they aired it on, what channel was it? It was something weird, like something like ABC Family. I think that's actually what it was, because I feel like I remember watching reruns of Whose Line Is It Anyway? And then Pat Robertson would be on, and he'd be like, I don't know, giving you the big headlines of the day. And I've never seen a full episode of it, but I have seen, 5 minutes of Pat Robertson doing his incredibly bad version of a late night talk show monologue.
Totally, yeah. It's not great. It's not great at all. I think that like maybe if you've lived most of your life outside of the bubble of evangelical Christianity, you might be familiar with some of Pat Robertson's antics. Like, he was the guy who blamed Hurricane Katrina, among other things, on like LGBTQ people and also like the feminist agenda. That was a wild moment in the early 2000s. You also might remember that this is more recent. He called Black Lives Matter protesters anti-Christian. So he's on his bullshit constantly. There's also, man, he has so many bonkers takes, and if you kind of start googling around though, and you want to find some of these especially spicy ones, you can. One time on the 700 Club, he decided that it would be a good idea to say that it'd be cool if somebody nuked the State Department.
It's funny. It's honestly, I feel like the humor, it doesn't come through unless, okay, listen, you got to pause this episode. You need to watch like just a short clip on YouTube of him, because he talks just like a very slow old man, and the idea of that guy being like someone should nuke the State Department is so funny.
Yeah, I think so too. It's beyond belief, this guy. He has a type of energy that we could only, we can only hope to bring to this podcast. We've never said we should nuke the State Department, though. So us radical leftists and Pat Robertson, we have diverging opinions on this. Another time, though, he did also mention that he mentioned this like on air, like in a sort of prolonged rant, that it'd be a good idea to assassinate Hugo Chavez. Like, what are you doing, my guy? It's so crazy that like this is stuff that would get you like this is stuff that would get you destroyed on Twitch these days, but this guy was doing it on like a weird cable TV show, and people thought he was a great pastor for it. I think that's bad. I don't know. Like, what is this guy doing? Every time I read something from him, I'm just like, what is this? Like, why are you doing this? And in the end, it's just to warp the brains of, I don't know, evangelical Christians and stir the pot and get them really riled up. He had no problem saying some extremely disgusting and hateful things to get evangelicals to do what he wanted them to do. And I don't know, that's his legacy. So it's pretty clear Pat Robertson is a reactionary figure on the Christian right, to say the least. You've probably heard most of the stuff that I've said already, but buckle in, because we're about to tell you some stuff about Pat Robertson that you didn't know. That's right. We're doing Pat Facts.
Pat Facts, that's right. Exactly. It's Pat Facts time. We could talk about a lot of things related to Pat Robertson, and in the past we've done some profiles of evangelicals, like we had our friend Martin Wendell-Jones to talk about Jim Bakker in the past. Extremely funny, wild character. Jerry Falwell, he's in the mix. They're all kind of like the same generation of weirdos on TV. But instead of doing a whole profile of Pat Robertson, we want to talk about his particular relationship with a Guatemalan dictator named Efrain Rios Montt, who is a kind of like, I don't know, I feel like sort of a B character in the way that we talk about Latin America. Like, people don't really talk about him much, or I don't know, like if you're like really invested in Central America, you probably know about him, but I don't know. It took me a long time to know about him, and I feel like a person who tries to think about Latin America a lot. So maybe somebody who's just kind of like further and further down in the memory banks. He was only the president for about a year, but also presided over the deadliest period of dictatorship in Guatemala. And Pat Robertson, he said that's the kind of guy that I think God wants in place in that country. So we're going to talk about Pat Robertson's relationship to Guatemala in particular, and kind of what is going on there.
Totally. It's worth noting here at the top too. Not only is Efrain Rios Montt a Guatemalan dictator, but he's also an evangelical Guatemalan dictator. That's right, folks.
Right.
This dictator has been born again. It's so absurd. And Pat Robertson, yeah, exactly. Just like you said, he thought this is the guy I want to hitch my wagon to, and he did. It's so wild because it's not even like not only was it just in the 80s, like when Pat Robertson was like, maybe he didn't know any better. Maybe, he did something stupid and he just is a dumb idiot. But even in 2015, Pat Robertson was still defending this guy. So like long after the record was pretty clear that Rios Montt was like, sitting atop a throne of human skulls, Pat Robertson was like, all right, fine with me. This guy is great.
Yeah, it's a good moment to pause. I don't know if I've said this on the podcast in the past or not, but I have this kind of working thing that I'm trying out, trying to see if it works or not, if it fits. This idea that, people who are in power are either evil or stupid, and it's really difficult to figure out which is which. So, for example, Pat Robertson, I feel like a person I cannot make a judgment about. I can't tell if he is just actively evil or like profoundly stupid. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive categories. You can be so stupid that you are evil, or you can be so evil that you are stupid. But, it's kind of like, which one do you privilege? And I feel like, for Pat Robertson to say on the 700 Club in 2015 that Efrain Rios Montt is a good dude, it's just like, man, I don't know. I don't know what this guy's doing. Like, it's something I can't figure out, even with the cynical, broken brain that I have.
Yeah, no, I get it. I agree with you. There are some, we'll talk about these more in a bit, but there's some interesting hypotheses that people have for about exactly why Pat Robertson thinks Rios Montt is like a person he wants to be associated with. And I don't know. It's speculation, but we'll get there in a little bit. We'll talk about Pat Robertson's smooth brain and and why maybe this is interesting for him. All right, Dean. So we have some of the table setting out here. We've put these plates down, but we gotta get these knives and forks out on the table. Do you want to say some more about Rios Montt? Give the people the context they need.
Yep, I'm getting my salad fork ready right now. So Rios Montt, he's a wild guy. There's a really good book if you want to read more about it. It's called Terror in the Land of the Holy Spirit. It's by Virginia Gerard Burnett. Sorry to Virginia for pronouncing it wrong, but it's a really good book, and it is all about Rios Montt and Guatemala in general, but really digging into his very gross, violent theology. I read it during my PhD, and it is a very troubling book, but really well done. She also captures some of the different religious angles around him. So I thought maybe we could start there. We'll get some stuff about Rios Montt on the table, and then we'll talk about Pat Robertson, because I feel like to understand why Pat Robertson is so bonkers for supporting this guy, you really got to know the scale of what's going on. So she writes in the book, here's just some basic facts in the beginning. According to 2 truth commissions, more than 200,000 people died in political violence over the course of the 36-year war in Guatemala, the vast majority, upward of 90% by all accounts, at the hands of security forces, the army, special forces, and civil patrols. Of this grim total, 43% died during Rios Montt's 17 months in office. So, that's pretty wild. 36 years of the Civil War, which was between the government, and there was armed left-wing guerrilla resistance during that time. But, the government, for sure, was, the primary source of violence. And for 43% of those murders to have taken place in just under 2 years out of that whole 36 years, that's, the scale of murder and blood that we're talking about on Rios Montt's hands.
And in fact, in 2010, he was tried. Rios Montt was tried in Guatemala, and it was for genocide, literally genocide.
Right.
So it's that word is not used in any kind of weak way in the situation. It is literally what happened.
Exactly, and it's specifically genocide against indigenous Mayan peoples in Guatemala. you might know the story of Rigoberta Menchú. Maybe we'll talk about her again at the end of the episode. She is an incredible person, by the way. She's maybe like, if this episode really bums you out learning about Pat Robertson in Guatemala, just spend some time learning about Rigoberta Menchú. You'll feel a lot better. She is a Catholic indigenous catechist from Guatemala and is an incredible, I don't know, human rights defender and all that kind of stuff. She has a really cool story. But anyway, she was from that community. So the genocide was against the indigenous peoples in Guatemala, but as you can guess, lots of other poor people as well. Mostly like violence in the countryside. So he's presiding over this incredibly violent governmental policy, and there's this theology that goes underneath it as well. So Gerard Burnett says, Rios Montt's civil religious ideal was as precise and comprehensible as the teachings of his evangelical church. Repent, live right, and be saved. But for those who refuse the path of righteousness, the consequences were as inexorable as the horsemen of the apocalypse. So you might be asking yourself, how does somebody who is an evangelical, a born-again Christian, end up presiding over such a violent situation, violent government? Or maybe you're not asking yourself that because, I mean, we've got our own versions of that here in the global north. But let me say a little bit about it, because I think actually Rios Montt's particular brand of evangelicalism is probably kind of surprising in some ways, and has some really interesting links to the United States. So let me read a little bit more, and then we can break it down here, Matt. So
Yeah.
she says, Rios Montt was converted through contact with lay pastors of the Church of the Word, Iglesia Cristiana Verbo, or simply Verbo, as it was commonly known. Verbo was a mission of a California-based organization called Gospel Outreach, itself the product of the Jesus Freak movement of the early 1970s. Gospel Outreach originated as an experiment in communal living, but it had evolved over the years into a conservative neo-Pentecostal church. The denomination was a small one in the U.S., but after its arrival in Guatemala following the earthquake, there was a big earthquake, the church attracted a large following, one of the several new denominations that catered to wealthy people in Guatemala City, to whom its particular variety of Pentecostalism, which stressed morality and the tangible rewards of right living, particularly appealed. Although Verbo continued to maintain some U.S. ties, by the early 80s, the denomination had largely gone native in the sense that the bulk of its leadership, funding, and doctrinal focus was Guatemalan, creating an inverse missionary relationship with the mother church back in California. So this is a really wild story. I mean, we've talked also on this podcast before, even recently, about the kind of export of evangelicalism from the U.S. to Latin America and what it does, and it kind of plants these seeds of reactionary counter-revolution and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, there's more to that story. Like, there are progressive evangelicals, there's kind of a lot going on there, but this kind of transmission, I think, is so fascinating because it comes out of that, like, weird Christian hippie movement, you know, like, we've also talked about on the show, Matt and I both went to this place called Cornerstone Festival in Bushnell, Illinois, which came out of the Jesus Freak movement also. So just really interesting. And I don't know about you, Matt, but like when I read that they started out as this kind of communal Jesus Freak thing and then like mutated into a conservative neo-Pentecostal church, I was like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about for sure.
Totally. Yeah. You know, before we recorded this, I sent Dean an old PBS spot where they were reporting on Rios Montt in Guatemala, and it's really interesting because I mean it's from 1982, and it's dated and interesting though how even on PBS, the liberal PBS, they're still just repeating like Reaganite sort of talking points about Latin America and Guatemala. But what's interesting is in this PBS spot, they do have the pastor of this particular like community that Rios Montt went to, and they have pictures of them together. And the pastor is interesting because he is literally that. He is like American Christian Jesus Freak hippie turned like, more straight-laced fascist pastor in Guatemala. And it's interesting because they interview him on this PBS thing, and he's just like, yeah, Rios Montt, he's a really upstanding guy. He has a lot of integrity. He keeps, emphasizing that. And it's just like, okay, but meanwhile, if you actually asked, the indigenous people of Guatemala, like, what's going on, you would hear a very different story.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's interesting, too, because Rios Montt had this history in the military, and he would often talk about, too, like his conversion experience. And, he was part of a right-wing kind of military apparatus, and He came to be president as a result of a coup that he led. And that coup also was kind of tied up in this conversion narrative where it was Rios Montt's kind of divinely mandated duty to bring Guatemala back to God. And that really permeates his presidency. So a little bit more from this book. The author writes, one of Rios Montt's first acts as president was to evoke his church's teachings that in a multitude of counselors there's safety, by appointing 2 fellow parishioners from Verba to specially created ad hoc positions as secretary to the private affairs of the president and secretary of the president of the republic. He referred to these advisors as my conscience, thereby setting off alarms within the army that members of Verba might co-opt military influence. Indeed, it was supposedly exactly these concerns that church advisors enjoyed undue sway over Rios Montt that led the Army High Command to eventually oust Rios Montt in the coup of August 8, 1983. So, he is like literally marrying these kind of pieces of his life, like the conversion and the mandate as president. And it comes through, too, in his presidency because he also had all these wild things. Like, he would often talk theologically about the mission of saving Guatemala. He would talk about kind of how, like, if you take care of your individual soul, the rest of society will sort itself out. And I think this is one of the weirdest things, just to add one more piece from this book. She says, within days of taking office on March 23rd, Rios Montt set out the parameters of La Nueva Guatemala, or the New Guatemala, in a series of television speeches broadcast weekly on Sunday nights. These discursos del domingo were popularly known as sermons, and for good reason. The general, usually clad in civilian clothes with a Bible near at hand, and often standing beside an elaborate candelabrum, addressed his audience on a variety of political, economic, and social topics meant to establish the framework for a new Guatemala, and indeed a new Guatemalan. The discursos, while far from fidelesque in duration, a great joke by the way, could last for an hour or more, depending on the general's frame of mind and range of vision on a given evening. While many discursos were predominantly political in nature, most also touched on family life, health, and other edifying topics. The common link in all the discursos, however, was a religious or moral subtext solidly embedded in an evangelical narrative framework. So this guy is literally like, a dictator televangelist. He is a Pat Robertson who did win the election, or at least won the coup. He's on TV. He's holding the Bible. He's saying you got to get back to Christ. And guess what? If you don't, or you're still Catholic, or you're an indigenous person, then you're on the wrong side. We have to kill you. So there's this really kind of like scary, dark, and like, I don't know, strange like juxtaposition of things. Like, on the one hand, it seems extremely funny to me, like maybe that's just my like coping mechanism, but I guess it's like, it's very funny to imagine this like weird guy who heard some Jesus freak pastor from California tell him that he's like born again. And now he's on TV, like reading the Bible to a bunch of people in Guatemala. But on the other hand, it's so horrifying because like the message is, you've got to save your individual soul. And that is how we have a new Guatemala. But that sort of soteriology also has this incredibly brutal social consequence, which is that, like, if you're not on board with saving your individual soul, then, like, you can get wrecked, So it's really, really scary. And like I said, 43% of all of the killings done in the 36-year war were done under his presidency. So this is the guy that Pat Robertson is a big fan of.
Yeah, and maybe just to stress the point a bit more, right? That 43% number is really important. But in the opening of Penning Their Nose book, The People of God, there's actually a really important story that she tells that she's using it in a really particular way in her book, so like she doesn't kind of get into all of the context surrounding it. But the story that she opens with is a story about Guatemala in 1982. And she's talking about the indigenous people who are living, in the mountains, and that if you were Catholic, the story she tells specifically is about these Catholic catechists, people who are studying for confirmation and kind of like figuring this whole thing out. But if you were one of those people, you would have been a dissident. You would have been flagged by the security forces as being a dissident, of being like anti-government, because you're Catholic, right? Because the Bible in those hands, and especially in this like time frame, is like subversive. So she paints a story of like a church in the catacombs kind of thing. And the story that she tells is really interesting. I mean, I don't know. Penny no, she's a real journalist and has like some pretty journalistic chops. I don't know exactly, how to corroborate the story, but the story she tells is really interesting because these catechists, they're in this town, and the army comes into the town and tells the village people, the indigenous people who are living there, you've got to like kill these catechists, or we're going to come and kill everybody in the village. We're going to burn it down. So that's the choice that the army makes them confront. And the catechists, in I mean a pretty I don't know, an incredible move, but also extremely sad move, say like to the people in the village, like, yeah, you should probably just kill us, because it's either you kill us and you all live, or or sorry, can you still hear me, Dean?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. My headphone just made a weird noise.
Oh yeah.
Okay, it's fine. You can either kill us and you all live, or don't kill us and then everybody dies. So, anyways, the villagers end up killing the catechists, and like that's the conclusion of the story. Like I guess it's important because like of the 43% that Rios Montt was responsible for killing, it's like this is sort of the dynamic that I think is important, right? It's like very much an anti-Catholic sentiment, and those are the lines which with the conflict were drawn. So it's a Christian on Christian violence kind of moment, and again, once again, I'll just say it again. Pat Robertson, this is the guy he thought it was very cool, who he was all about. Wild.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and like I said too, Rigoberta Menchú, she's the person you want to learn about if you want to get a sense of what that kind of Catholic dissident movement looked like. There was, like I said, a sort of armed resistance, which was not completely Catholic. I mean, it's not the same as like the Sandinistas, which also wasn't completely Catholic, but maybe more direct. So I don't want to overstate it. But the kind of suggestion or insinuation from Rios Montt was, if you're Catholic, you must not be with me. You're not with the president. And if you're Catholic, then you must also be sort of open to listening to the guerrillas. And, it's like all kinds of people were killed just by virtue of guilt by association and so on, whether or not they were related to the guerrillas. But Catholicism would have tagged you, and being an indigenous or Mayan person, I should say, especially, would have tagged you as being kind of open to being radicalized. And like, yeah, it's wild. When you read, so Rigoberta Menchú, she has a famous like dialogue or interview that is published as I Rigoberta Menchú, or sometimes it's called My Name is Rigoberta Menchú. There's a lot of controversy over that book specifically, but it's a really good place to look if you want to kind of get an inside view of what's going on. And she talks at length about kind of what, like, she was a catechist herself, so she talks a lot about what that looked like in indigenous communities and so on. What's interesting about her, I don't know, this is like a weird aside, but now I'm on it, so I'm just going to follow it to the end.
You got to.
She was actually outside of Guatemala during Rios Montt's presidency because she had basically been forced into exile in Mexico. And she lived in Chiapas with Samuel Ruiz, the bishop who ended up being the one of the mediating, peacemaking people between the Zapatistas and the Mexican state. So she lived in that community for a while and then returned to Guatemala. So it's really fascinating because like it was already very bad in Guatemala and she left. Then Rios Montt became the president, and she was basically dealing with her like trauma and also getting formed in other ways in Chiapas, and then returned. So it's kind of like, I don't know, if Rios Montt is sort of this like strange product of U.S. evangelicals infiltrating Latin America and, then supporting them from abroad through people like Pat Robertson, Rigoberta Menchú is basically the complete opposite, right? She's like an indigenous Catholic in Guatemala who is supported internationally by like another Catholic in another heavily indigenized Catholic place in Mexico. So, like I said, if you're feeling bummed about Pat Robertson and Rios Montt at the end of this, just check out Rigoberta Menchú. She'll give you something to be excited about.
Yep, and you might need that kind of uplifting note after all this. All right, we've talked for about 30 minutes about Rios Montt, and we're going to keep talking about him. But now it's time to introduce Pat Robertson with some Pat facts. All right, so this is from an article on Right Wing Watch, which is called "Pat Robertson Hails Guatemalan Dictator Charged with Genocide." I see where this one's going. At the height of the bloodshed under Rios Montt, reports put the number of killings and disappearances at more than 3,000 per month. Patrick Daniels of the Guatemala Solidarity Network noted, such was the extent of the violence that in 1999, the UN Commission concluded that it constituted acts of genocide. His regime specifically targeted indigenous communities with violence and displacement, and in 2013, Rios Montt was convicted of genocide for crimes committed against the Maya. Hunger, systemic rape, and forced displacements were all used as tools of war against the Mayan people, the BBC reported. However, the conviction was overturned due to legal technicality, and Rios Montt was later declared unfit to stand for trial. The article goes on to say, today, in 2015, Robertson gushed over Rios Montt, claiming that he was the real victim because he was targeted by liberals for being a good Christian. I'm so mad just reading this. Absolutely furious. This is a quote here from Pat Robertson. I know Efrain Rios Montt, who was the president there, he said. He's a terrific guy. He was with the El Verbo Church, and they had a marvelous government. But the left got him, and he couldn't survive. They just went after him and attacked him. The United States State Department went after him. It was terrible. Pat Robertson, not a great understander of international politics. Like, again, this is the axes of, like, are you dumb or are you evil? And I literally don't know. Impossible to tell based on the data we have available to us, but calling a dude who literally did genocide a terrific guy is a wild thing to do in literally 2015, right? This is 2 years after 2013, after he was tried. This is after it was all out. People knew who Rios Montt was in the United States because it was like a national news, not national. It was like a global news story that he was being tried, because, like, it's rare that, like, dictators actually get tried for their crimes against humanity, but Rios Montt did, and oh my God, Pat Robertson, what are you doing? Stop.
Yeah, I mean, he has a real, like, sunk cost situation with Rios Montt as well, because he interviewed Rios Montt on the 700 Club as soon as he became the general after the coup. In fact, I think that was his first interview was given to the 700 Club, or at least pretty quick after that. So he was a true believer right away. There's also a lot of really weird stuff with him. Like right after he was himself deposed in the coup that we mentioned earlier, because the fascist military was like, this guy's too Christian. There was this really
what would people
bizarre.
do if they found out I was a Jesus freak? And it is if they're gonna kill you, they're gonna kill you right out of the government.
That's right. That's why Toby Mac is not the president today. Yeah. So that right after he was couped in 1984, there was this book that must have been like rush published. I don't really know the whole story around it, but it's called Efrain Rios Montt, Servant or Dictator: The Real Story of Guatemala's Controversial Born-Again President, by, I don't know, these two nerds, Joseph M. Fuzo and David Shapansky. So that book, it came out in 1984, and Pat Robertson wrote the foreword to it. And the forward is so weird. Like, he has this kind of strange, like, I don't know, sort of trying to create some sense of distance from Rios Montt, but, like, can't seem to hold himself back, because then he basically starts praising him for being, like, a great Christian. And by the end of it, he's like, who knows, like, we'll find out more about what the real story was soon enough. But, like, the whole thrust of it is that he's, like, really excited that this Christian was in power. In fact, he says, he's talking a little bit about it. He says in this foreword, I knew that only God could sustain this fledgling government. The treasury of Guatemala had been depleted. Communists were attacking villages in the hills. The United States government was refusing help because of the human rights violations of the previous regime. The world's press, often leftist in orientation, was making Rios Montt out to be a pietist buffoon. The only recourse was prayer. I enlisted the prayers of tens of thousands of evangelicals across America. We urgently besought the Lord to grant physical safety to Rios Montt and the blessing of God upon his new government. And he goes on to say a lot more, but he says, little by little, the miracle began to unfold. The country was stabilized. Democratic processes, never a reality in Guatemala, began to be put into place. Above all, the all-pervasive graft and corruption were eliminated, along with the terror of the death squads. So this is insane, because it is like literally the opposite is true. Like, the terror of the death squads was amplified, like, by several degrees. so much so that Rios Montt was the bloodiest of all the dictators. So, like, Pat Robertson is enlisting these tens of thousands of evangelicals and just actively, like, I don't know, lying or not understanding or being incapable of, like, knowing what's going on. That's what I mean, like, is he evil or stupid? It's kind of like statements like this that make me feel like he's evil, I guess, because it is so baldly untrue that, like, there's no way that you could be that, that involved on the one hand and that removed, like, in your brain on the other. But that's when it becomes undecidable, because it's like, I don't know, maybe he just is that badly broken in his brain. So anyway, that's the foreword that Pat Robertson decided to write right after Efrain Rios Montt was deposed.
I think the evangelicals really need to, like, come to terms with this, because I don't know. It's not like just because you were misled by Pat Robertson, like, it doesn't mean that you're culpable for genocide, for sure. But, like, but I think what it does mean, though, is that, like, thousands and thousands of American evangelicals were praying for Rios Montt, and it was only God that was holding the government together. But then, like, he literally got couped like a year later. So it's just like, I don't know. Is your prayer working? Like, how do you square all this? I would love to know. It's just
That's true.
So silly.
The evangelical dictator theodicy is what this should be formally named.
Oh my gosh, they should teach that in seminaries everywhere. Okay, so there you go. There's some stuff there about Robertson and Rios Montt, but here's some more stuff, even more fat facts for you. This is from a Counterpunch article from 2005. So this is before Rios Montt was tried, but after people knew about it. Okay, but it's about, again, Pat Robertson and his particular relationship with Rios Montt. And the article says, Robertson extended Christian televangelism to Central America. By the 1980s, Pat Robertson's program, the 700 Club, reached 3.1 million viewers in Guatemala. Robertson took an interest in the strife-torn Central American nation, developing warm ties to General Efrain Rios Montt, a born-again evangelical Christian. When Rios Montt took power in the military coup d'etat in March of 1982, Robertson immediately flew to Guatemala, meeting with the incoming president a scant 5 days after he came to power. Later, Robertson aired an interview with Rios Montt on the 700 Club and extolled the new military government. But there's more. So that's pretty bad. Like, literally 5 days is nuts. Pat Robertson, stop. You shouldn't do this. Okay, Robertson's visit came at a particularly sensitive time. Guatemala's dirt-poor indigenous communities, who made up half the country's population, were suffering greatly at the hands of U.S.-funded military. The armed forces had taken over Indian land that seemed fertile for cattle exploiting, or a promising site to drill for oil. Again, this article is going to keep using the word Indians, which is maybe not my preference, but that's what they do here. Those Indians who dared resist were massacred. Rios Montt, a staunch anti-communist supported by U.S. President Reagan, was determined to wipe out the Marxist URNG, the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Union rebels. However, according to Amnesty International, thousands of people with no connection to the armed struggle were killed by the regime. Not surprisingly, many Indians turned to armed resistance. To deal with the ever-worsening situation, Rios Montt proposed a so-called Guns and Beans campaign. Rios Montt explained the plan very succinctly. If you're with us, we'll feed you. If not, we'll kill you. For Robertson, however, Rios Montt's extermination policy was of little account. Astonishingly, the televangelist wrote, I found Rios Montt to be a man of humility, impeccable personal integrity, and a deep faith in Jesus Christ. I'm laughing because I don't know what else to do in the face of something that is, like, so baldly awful.
There's no way that Pat Robertson at least didn't know that Rios Montt was actively threatening people on TV, right? I mean, this is a guy whose whole life is organized around being on TV, and he obviously met Rios Montt, and it's hard to imagine Rios Montt wasn't, like, proud of those policies as well. That's, like, his stated thing. It's not a secret, right? Like, he's saying it all over the place, and that's what always leads me to feel like, I feel like on the big meter of evil or stupid, Pat Robertson leans more toward the evil side, because he has to have heard that stuff and found some way of dismissing it or not caring about it. And like you said, even after it has all come to light, everybody knows about it, still in 2015, he's been charged with genocide. Pat Robertson's like, I think he's a great Christian, and it's all those dang leftists who are spreading whatever they want about it. That's the big problem. Like, I feel like you have to be, like, the whole point is that Robertson would say that they were close, that he knew Rios Montt really well. So, like, I don't know, maybe he didn't know him that well or something, but the irony is, like, for that to be true, there's no way that he could have missed that.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, I think that question, like, what is going on in Pat Robertson's brain, is one that we can probably never know solidly. But here's one hypothesis to why this particular relationship was important to Pat Robertson, and also what he was doing in all of this, and maybe why he would overlook it, because, like you said, pretty hard to miss. The Counterpunch article goes on to say one reason that Rios Montt may have appealed to Robertson was the dictator's dislike of Catholic priests. In the 1980s, they had become an obstacle to the expansion of evangelical Protestantism. Working within indigenous communities, Catholic priests had been driven out or murdered. Protestant sects, on the other hand, allied to the Guatemalan military. They preached individual conversion, the importance of obedience to military and political authority, the merits of capitalism, and the value of inequality. Rios Montt's own Church of the Word went so far as to define priests and nuns as the enemy. According to Walter Lefebvre, a historian of Central America, 3 priests were killed within a 36-month period in just one province. With the Catholic Church out of the way, Rios Montt conducted a scorched earth policy. His forces massacred as many as 15,000 indigenous people. We can't know the inner workings of someone like Pat Robertson's brain, and maybe we don't even really want to. But this is a pretty strong hypothesis to me, right? Like, if Pat Robertson is actually internally a nihilist and, like, really only cares about people watching the 700 Club, which I think is a pretty good hypothesis, having a dictator in Guatemala, a place that is, where evangelicalism, like, is maybe growing or taking hold, or there's already, like, an investment of evangelical infrastructure, it makes sense if this guy is going to, like, oust Catholics and persecute Catholics into the ground, literally, so that more people watch this TV show. I mean, I don't know. It's bleak, right? That's a very bleak hypothesis. That it's just like that Pat Robertson is, like, so completely devoid of any sort of moral character. But I don't know. It doesn't seem like that much of a stretch.
Yeah, I mean, I just finished watching Succession, and I feel like this guy's worse than Logan Roy could ever be. Just a very spooky, scary guy altogether. The other kind of weird juxtaposition with all that, too, all that violence, is even the way that evangelicalism encourages you to talk about things that you do or campaigns that you run. And what I'm thinking about in particular is when Robertson was doing fundraising, he had this telethon for the Guatemalan military, which is insane. And the name of the campaign was International Love Lift, which was related to Rios Montt's relief program linked to gospel outreach, which was the U.S. connection. The article that I was just reading from goes on to say Robertson's Christian Broadcasting Network reportedly sponsored a campaign to provide money as well as agricultural and medical technicians to aid in the design of Rios Montt's first model villages. So it's just like, I don't know, calling something like, your International Love Lift or doing these, like, telethons for, like, literal fascists is so weird, because evangelicalism also relies on all this infantilizing kind of rhetoric, and it sounds the way they brand it is always in these kind of sweet ways, or it's like world vision or whatever, and instead of getting, like, a picture of a goat or something that you bought for a kid, you're just, like, literally contributing to, like, the genocide of indigenous peoples in Guatemala.
Totally.
And, I don't know,
Yeah,
Pat Robertson is telling you that's fine.
Exactly. Pat Robertson is doing a telethon to raise money for Rios Montt and, like, building these villages or whatever, but, like, meanwhile Rios Montt is, like, deploying death squads to, like, murder indigenous people and, like, burn their houses down. And I don't know, that connection, I guess it's like, we had the conversation not too long ago about religious fundamentalism and, like, the radicalization of the right in Latin America. And I guess, like, this is an important story within that same realm, because I mean, it's exactly what's happening. But I think it's important because it makes that link really clear, right? That there are Christians in the United States who are specifically supporting this particular type of, like, religious expression, because it can be so easily weaponized against things that the United States just, like, doesn't like. I don't want to say that, like, evangelical Christianity is a psyop in Latin America, but it does look that way in some capacity.
I'll say it because in many cases it literally is. Like, that just is what it is. Like, we've talked about in Cuba, for example, Echo Cuba is, like, a USAID funded project by a Cuban expat that is designed to basically run, like, homophobic opposition to the government. Like, that is just literally, it's what it does, like, it's not to say that every evangelical in Latin America is on board with that program, or that it's, like, evangelicals maybe don't have their own motivation for doing that, but it's not accidental. Like, the U.S. government understands that it is an asset to them to spread that kind of thing and to disrupt the links of solidarity between Catholics and others in the region. I think that is important to mention. Like, there is a real political angle to it. Pat Robertson was also close to Ronald Reagan. You know, like, these are all kind of, I don't know, people passing around the same documents about what's going on. Like, it's bad stuff. It is important to mention that there's complexity among evangelicalism in Latin America. There are often progressive evangelicals who do ally with liberation people and forces, and I think that is also incredibly unique and undertold and important to not lose sight of. But you know, it's like, this is a tried and true method for accomplishing violent ends in Latin America. Like, get an evangelical in power, raise a bunch of money among evangelicals or kind of private sectors in places like the U.S. and funnel it. And like, it wasn't just Guatemala. Like, they Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and Jim Baker, they would also tour around Latin America and hang out with other dictators in other countries. That comes out a little bit in Penny Lerneau's work as well. So, you know, they had a habit of doing this, and I think there's an important confluence of like U.S. imperialism and, you know, the cynical ends of like evangelical televangelists.
Dean, what's your takeaway? Right, Pat Robertson, he's dead, and I'm not upset about it. What do you think this says about the legacy of Pat Robertson? What do we take away from this whole episode?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that he is an important person for people to understand, and to like understand too the gravity and depth of the kind of violence that he brought into the world. Because even in the the obituaries of him going around, I mean, a lot of people rightly have called attention to this, so I think that's good. Like, there is a sense that public memory is like willing to, you know, bury Pat Robertson in his own shit, and that's important. But on the whole, it's like, you know, Christians are always anxious, I think, about like saying something bad about anybody, especially another Christian. And it's like, maybe it would have been great if Pat Robertson had this conversion moment at the end of his life and he was like, that's all bad, and he came to Jesus or whatever. But like, he probably didn't. It doesn't seem like he did do that. And that is not my fault, you know? And I think it's important to recognize how violent Christianity really can be, and to name that as Christians too, to be like, that's very bad. Pat Robertson is on the side of the enemy, and he made that choice in his life, and that sucks. It sucks for him, and it sucks even more for the tens of thousands of people who have literally been murdered because he, you know, raised money for the bullets that killed them. Like, Pat Robertson has blood on his hands, and I don't know, like, whatever happens after you die, I do think he's going to have to answer for that.
All right, there you have it, folks. Dean's got it figured out, and I agree. He's right.
Yeah, that's right. You know, maybe one last thing, though. Now I'm just, like, on a roll thinking about how bad evangelicals are. I think, like, the other piece, too, is to, like, so we've zeroed in on this one story of Rios Montt in the 1980s, but this is something that is repeated in our own time, like in very recent history. You know, like Bolsonaro, he was elected on a wave of evangelical voters, and it was a similar kind of thing. You saw evangelicals lining up to support Bolsonaro along with the bourgeoisie. You know, lots of Christian publications were, like, open to Bolsonaro and his government. You see that huge force in Brazil for sure. Like I mentioned a minute ago, there's a concerted effort among the U.S. government to bolster evangelicals in Cuba specifically to try to, cause problems arbitrarily, you know, just create issues and so on. You saw the same thing in Bolivia, like Janine Áñez, the coup leader or coup president at the time. You know, she was talking about how they were bringing the Bible back into the palace and so on. So it's like these kinds of political uses of evangelicalism and their affinities with U.S. evangelicalism are like still around and still blocking attempts to actually create a just society in places like Latin America. So just to like point out maybe that this event is, I don't know, whatever, 40 years ago or something, but it's still with us. Like, they're still trying it, and all the more reason for Christians to be super vigilant and trying to dismantle that theology in the global north, because it does make its way down there in very murderous kind of ways.
Yeah, I think that's right. You know, you said a minute ago. You said kind of at the beginning of this episode that Pat Robertson, he had a failed presidential run, but this is the guy who succeeded. And I think that's actually maybe it's a funny thing that you said, but it's also maybe true in a lot of different ways in the United States, that there are, this emerging sort of like group of Christian nationalists or whatever. And I'm not saying they're all like Rios Montt or whatever, but they aren't dissimilar, that this is maybe what a particular type of evangelical politics looks like in practice. And you don't want it. Tell your friends, tell your parents. It's bad.
That's right. So don't donate to the 700 Club. Don't even donate to the 420 Club unless somebody else starts that podcast, in which case you can donate to them. That's probably fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to do a TV televangelistic marathon because I don't know what you're going to do with that kind of money, and I'm smarter than Pat Robertson. But, you can make your own decision for sure, and maybe we'll use that to support not a left-wing paramilitary, but maybe like, a few more pizzas. I think that would be fine.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/Magnificast. If you support us at any level, you get a great invite to our behind the paywall, super secret Discord channel where we're talking about unions. We're talking about cats. We're posting pictures of Kirby, and it's great. We love it. And you will too. So get on in there. You can also get access to a behind the paywall podcast called The Lock-In that we do once a month or so, and sometimes there's an early episode even there for you. So that's all great. You should support us, or don't. It's fine too. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I